We're going to be exploring the template literals or the template strings, and this is just another way to create strings in JavaScript code. So whereas we typically might be using the single quotes or we might be using the double quotes, inherently it does make the code less readable as we need to break in and out of quotes if we need to express an expression, or if we do need to have a new line as in within the console or within a text area, then that code becomes less readable. Whereas with the backticks and using the backtick format with the template literals, you can have the backtick and you can break into expressions with the $ curly brackets, and then any new lines, if you do have new lines, they're going to be reflected. So you can have multiple line string values within the source code, and this can also make your source code more readable. And then we've got the output here using the double quotes, the single quotes, so that's no problem within the template literals. And that's coming up. This lesson we're going to be exploring the template literals. So I've created an HTML file and linked my JS file to that HTML file. The file that I'm going to be using for the JavaScript code is app4.js, and within the HTML, just going to clear out some of the code there, and the element that I'm going to be using is going to be this div with a class of output. So starting off by selecting the element using the document query selector, selecting the element with a class of output. And then now that we've got that element, we can update some of the text content of that element. And for now, we'll just say hello world. So that gives us the output of hello world. And when we are working with strings, so if we set a variable and give it a value, actually I'm going to update this to let HTML and just set that to that, and then we'll update this to be HTML. So it still says hello world. What if we want it to move it to the next line? We can't do that with a regular string, and this the same goes for if we use the double quotes. So we are restricted if we want to move it to a new line with the double quotes as well. So it will still output the same content, but we don't have the ability to do a new line. And of course we can add in HTML if we want, but then we have to update the text content to output as HTML. So there is another option, and that's the template literals. So those are using the backticks, and to the left of most ones on your keyboard. If you go to the keyboard, the upper left-hand corner should have a key that has these backticks. And with the backticks, you can update, and we can actually use multi-line strings. So when we save that, we're still seeing the same output, because that's the property of the element. So it's just adding it in and it's removing all of the white space. But if we actually change this and we create a text content area, so let's create that. So text container. And using the document, let's create an element. And the element that we're creating is text area element. And we'll do the same for these values, and we're going to update the text content of these elements using the text container there. And I'll show you what the difference here is going to be in the way that the content is being output. And also within the HTML code, so this is fine as well. So it can now even make it more readable if you've got the hello world, as opposed to having it on the same line. And for the document body, we're going to append the text container object that we just created. So that will add it to the page. So there's our text container object. So if we take that text container and if we add that same HTML to it, and that same string value takes the spacing that we have with, and this will also do the same for the spacing within the other string values. So let's take a closer look at what we have with the template literals and what we can do with them. So they're actually untagged and they result in strings, and they're useful for string interpolation. So if you've got multi-line strings, unescaped new lines in the strings, so those are allowed as well. So this is an example of how we can have multi-lines. You can also add in an expression using the $ and the curly bracket. So let me give you an example of that. So in this case, if we do have the template literal and we want to add in expression, we can do that where we've got the $ and the curly brackets. So that will break back into the expression mode. So if we had something like 4 + 4, we would get that output being output there. You can also use variables. So if we had a value and this value was, let's say, hello world, we can also bring those values in. And the code will look a lot neater, whereas if we were doing this with the regular HTML, we would have to break out of the quotes and then break back into the quotes. So if we were to add this with the regular HTML, the format would look like this, where we would do the concatenation of the value, and then here is where we could add the value initially. And so just to comment out. So that would result in this type of effect. If we want to do it with the double quotes, it's going to be the same structure, except that we're using the double quotes. And this actually just makes the code more difficult to read. So that's one of the advantages of using the template literals, because the code is a little bit easier to read. So the result can still be the same, and we can also do the expressions here as well. But this way, it's all self-contained, and it's the flow of the content is a lot better. And additionally, when we do have the single quotes, if we do decide to use the quote, we have to break out of it with the backtick. And here, if we want to quote around world, we would have to do the same thing, where we would have to use the backslash in order to break out and be able to use the quotes. Whereas within the template literal, we can do both. We can have the double quotes, we can have the single quotes, and they're still all going to work properly within the template literal string. And again, going back to the Mozilla Developer Network, it removes the need to be able to escape using the backtick. If we're outputting the content into the console, and we go back and we look at what we've got in the console. So typically, if we're using either the single or double quotes and we want to move to a new line, then we would have to do the line break for the normal strings, which again is that backslash n. And I do need to comment out the double quote example. So within the regular output, we're still on the same line because it's just regular text content. Within the input text container, the text area, it is going to the second line, and as well within the console, it is going to the second line. So we do have an option, but with the template literals, you don't have to worry about that. As you write it, this is how it's going to be output. So let's go back to our template literal example. And once again, we'll just output that and highlight that within the code. And notice as well, when I am commenting it out, I can't just comment out the one line. I have to make sure that I'm capturing and commenting out all of the lines of code. As JavaScript, if you do comment it out, it's not going to be able to tell that you have the starting backtick and then you still need the closing backtick. So you just have the one, and that's where you're going to throw a code error. So this is just a quick example of what you can do with the template literal of the template string, as opposed to the quoted strings with the single or double quotes.